Hello and welcome to the webinar for SANS. Today I'm talking about building a practical cloud security roadmap in 2022. I wanted to start by just talking about some of the other, just making my show up. There you go. Took a second to come back, but it did. So these are some of the other SANS courses that you can probably look at in your own time. Just have that for reference over here without running with the APAC region. I wanted to start by talking about roadmap with this couple of pictures. Being in Melbourne, Australia, we were in lockdown for almost 2 years. And I wanted to show you what day one of working from home looked like for me and what day 1095, which is 3 years of almost doing this, looks like after 3 years. I had a really good chair for my back, a dog, and probably a better setup for my table. The reason this is a good analogy for this particular talk is because this is kind of how most cloud security roadmap starts. You start with a bare minimum. You may have a very, in my case, foldable chair, or you may just have one light, and now I have two. So it kind of starts something small. And my hope is by the end of this webinar, you would be able to have an understanding for what do you need to think from a practical perspective to build a cloud security roadmap. Bear in mind, this is probably an abstract version of what we run for the MGT 520 course in the SANS webinar, the SANS set of courses. So hopefully this is how valuable, and I'm pretty sure you would get some value out of some of the content that's being shared in this webinar over here. So going to the next slide. Come on. Just waiting for the computer to respond as it does. Oh, there you go. Jumped again. So I wanted to start by talking about, this is kind of like the title of my book as well, if I ever write one, Cloud Security of First Principle Thinking. And for people who may be from a cybersecurity background or people who may not be from a cybersecurity background, the first principle thinking of cybersecurity is just the basic question that you would ask in any organization. What are you protecting? Why is it important? And what are some of the common threats that you may come across if you are trying to protect something? And if you are in a position to protect something, how can you do certain, either implement solutions or define processes that would help you either find ways to detect when something is under threat, quote unquote, under threat, or find ways to respond to threats when they're realized. These are some of the first principle thinking when people would go through a cloud security roadmap. Now, as part of going through this, you probably have to go through an exercise of something called trust boundary. And by what I mean is in a cloud world, whether you're working with a public cloud, a private cloud, or any other kind of cloud, you would probably realize there's a trust boundary that you would have to extend from your existing environment. Like, for example, a lot of us may have been going to offices 9 to 5, enjoying that pleasure of having our dedicated desktop or laptop that we leave in the office when we walk out. But COVID changed everything. A lot of people started working from home. So we had to extend, quote unquote, our trust boundary from just being in the office to now allowing our home offices, our home Wi-Fi's, our home internet to be okay to be accessible within our trust boundary for our cybersecurity posture, as well as our network. In case of a cloud, it's a similar context. Now, not just the fact that you have your office, you have your home office, but you also have a cloud provider that you may be working with. Now, it could be any kind of cloud provider. It could be a private, public, or some kind of a hybrid cloud environment that you may be looking at. But the first principle thinking would always remain true. You would always have to think about it from a perspective of, what do I protect? How do I protect? How do I detect what I'm trying to protect, that it is under threat? And how do I respond quickly? Now, some of the terminologies you may also hear is mean time to detection as well. Talking about terminology, when you're trying to build a roadmap, you could be a cybersecurity leader, or you could be a technical lead, or you could be just an individual in an organization who's trying to build a roadmap towards what would a mature roadmap for a cloud security posture, a well-defined cloud security posture may look like in your organization. These are some of the terminologies you should be aware of as part of going through the exercise. Now, there are definitely a lot more terminologies that you can go into. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that I thought are relevant for conversations for both ends of the spectrum. Even if you have worked in cloud for some time and you're trying to implement it from start, or you have worked in other half of the organization, which may not be cybersecurity, but at least having an understanding of these terminologies gives you an idea for what to expect when you go into a cloud roadmap kind of thinking, or even a cloud security roadmap thinking. First one being DevOps and digital transformation. In a DevOps world, it's all about how do I automate as much as possible? How do I make my applications modern using modern agile work processes? Like I'm going to use something called a DevOps methodology or agile methodology to run a project or release a software. How do I release multiple times in a day instead of releasing once every 6 months? Like those kind of questions are what were basically the digital transformations of the digital transformation projects of the world asking and encouraging people to go down the path of saying we need digital transformation to be able to be more modern. Look at Netflix of the world. I can watch any movie from anywhere in the world within a matter of seconds. Look at, I guess, what's the, but maybe even you can use Facebook as an example for people who may be using Facebook or maybe using WhatsApp as well. These are all cloud-driven services. All of these are driven by the fact that you can have a lot of your infrastructure being run from anywhere in the world at any given point in time within a few minutes. So if I were to rewind, say, I don't know, 10 years ago, when we would have something like, I want to host facebook.com. If I was Mark Zuckerberg and I had to build facebook.com, the first thing I would do is I would start the website on my laptop. I would host it there. Soon I would start talking to my friends about it. I would tell them that, hey, I have this really amazing thefacebook.com for people who have seen the movie Social Network. I would start that and I would be able to start talking about how amazing the product is. But that's good when I'm only talking to my friends. My laptop can only take that much. Now, a couple of months in, my friends have started telling their friends about it. And we are trying to talk about, hey, what can we do to make this scalable? How do we make this available to, say, maybe the whole university or college that we may be working in? For that, they might go down the path of hosting a server. Now, to host a server, you have a couple of options. You can obviously go down the cloud path. You can go down the data center path. For this particular example, let's take the cloud path. One of the things you would have to consider at that point in time would be to use something called shared responsibility, which is how much of my infrastructure should I manage and how much of the infrastructure should be managed by another third party, which in this case could be a cloud provider. As you are going through the process of understanding this, there's a few more layers to it as well. It's not just the fact that you have your services that are being used by, say, Amazon, Azure, or Google Cloud, which are the three biggest cloud service providers in the world. It could go beyond that. It could also be services within these cloud service providers that you may have to use as a way to understand where do I draw the line for my trust boundary, which I spoke about just before. Am I okay for everyone who's using facebook.com or developing facebook.com to be in a stage where they get access to everything and everything is being managed by the cloud service provider? And all I do is I write beautiful code and I produce beautiful products. And that's what cloud by people. You could totally go down that path. Now, shared responsibility also leads me to the part where, I use the example of facebook.com on a laptop. How do I make this go into a cloud? I understand shared responsibility now. How do I migrate this onto the cloud? There are multiple ways to do this. Depending on the kind of application you have, you may look at versions like, I want to just lift and shift this onto a cloud service provider, which basically means I'm not going to change anything about the application. I'm going to move this from my data center to my cloud service provider, which could be a cloud service provider of my choice. Another way you could do is you could change the way facebook.com, which is the example that I'm going with. You can use that as a way to change the way it works at the moment. You might have found out about DevOps and you heard Ashish talk about how DevOps is amazing and you can release multiple times a product in a day. And you decide, I'm going to go DevOps and I'm going to go release this product into Amazon or Azure or Google Cloud using DevOps methodology, which means you are refactoring the application into a bit more modern application, which allows you to have the flexibility to release sooner, get the product out quicker to the customers, have a bit more agility in how you develop products so you get faster feedback. As you kind of have done that, decided, okay, I'm going to migrate this using DevOps principle. Let's just use that as an example and extend that forward. As you kind of walk through that process, you have to think about, am I using infrastructure of the cloud or am I using services of the cloud? If you're just using, say, infrastructure of the cloud, then you would have to consider the fact that you may have to configure how an infrastructure would be built in your cloud service provider. And once you are done that, then you need to think about, on this infrastructure that I have configured, how do I put my application on it? Or how do I send my application, release my application, or make feature updates to my application onto this cloud service provider? Now, this is just some of the initial thinking that you would go through, and that's why the terminology is important. As you kind of have done this, you probably would come across certain industry standards as well. And you would probably, oops, sorry, I just want to don't go back far enough. And you would come back maybe to a couple of standards that you may have to think about. You may have to think about things like what framework do I have in an organization to start building the roadmap? Should I consider compliance standards? Should I consider industry standards, which may be specific to the industry that I'm in? For example, oil and gas, your telecom industries, your electricity, oil, I mean, I guess mentioned oil and gas already. So depending on different industries you work in, you could have different standards that you may have to work on. As you kind of work through it, you may find that not every industry would have a framework that you can use. Fortunately, most of the popular cloud service providers have something called a cloud adoption framework that you can use. Now, a cloud adoption framework is available from all of the three popular cloud service provider, like Amazon, Google Cloud, as well as Microsoft Azure. These cloud service providers tell you in their own way what they think is the right way to migrate and use their cloud service. So you can use that as a benchmark. As you go through that process, and as we kind of go through the step-by-step process of thinking about what are some of the initial thinkings you would have in a cloud security roadmap process, we've thought about the infrastructure. We spoke about how would you migrate something to a cloud service provider. We've also spoke about what do you think about the product that you would be putting in, what kind of methodology you would want to have. We also spoke about whether there would be an industry standard or a compliance standard you need to consider. One thing that's worthwhile calling out, because we are talking about a global standard here, you could be an organization that may want to have their data only in their own country. Or you could be an organization that would want data to never leave your own country or your own particular region that you may be in, or in the state that you may be in. To have these considerations, you may also want to think about the cloud service provider that you choose. Do they have a data center that is available in your region? Now, there are certain terminologies like data residency, data sovereignty, where's the data located? Those kind of data questions are relevant for organizations that may have strict requirements for what can happen to a data outside of the organization, because technically your cloud service provider is a third party. And if you give them the data, for example, you may be working for a government organization and you may have personal identifiable information like my first name, my last name, my address, maybe my dog's favorite food, my dog's name, which may be my, I guess, secret question and answer for my username password for facebook.com. Not that I'm saying it is what it is, but some people may choose to love their dog so much that they might use them as a secret question and answer. If you are one of them, you probably want to change that. But otherwise, if you are an organization that has to deal with personal identifiable information on a daily basis, you may have to think about data, data security, data sovereignty. This is where would the data be processed and where would the data be located? These are some of the questions you may also have to consider. Last but not least, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just the basic information you would need to think about from a cloud security roadmap building process. The last one being cloud technical domains. There are a lot of services that are available in each of the cloud service provider. To give you an example, last year, for people who may be familiar with the Amazon Web Service at their annual event called AWS reInvent, they announced about 400 services. Yes, 400 new services were announced. Now, we may not use all of them, but we may use some of them. But having an understanding of what are the services that we use on an ongoing basis is quite important from an organization perspective, especially if you're thinking about security, for a couple of reasons. One being the fact that, say, for example, all you do is work with virtual machines. Then having the technical expertise of virtual machine in your team is quite crucial for you to be able to protect them and have an understanding for the first principle thinking that I was talking about earlier. What would it have? What's the threat? How do you monitor for threat? And how do you respond to it? So those are some of the things that you might have to consider as well. So this is kind of the basic terminology. And hopefully now you have a great understanding of what are some of the thinking process that you would have to go from a first principle thinking. Now, let's start building a roadmap. I didn't want to cover everything that's involved, but these are some of the basic foundational pieces that I think within the hour that you're spending with me would be beneficial for you to kind of take back and have some actionable things to consider if you are building your cloud security roadmap today. You could look at risk management, stakeholder management, cloud security building blocks, cloud security threats, supply chain, and team skills. We'll go through each one of these one by one, but these are some of the foundational pieces of building a roadmap that I consider are quite crucial and probably should be one of the first things to consider once you have an understanding of the terminology and once you have an understanding of the broader process that you would have to go through. Let's talk about risk management first. Now, every organization will deal with risk differently. You may have a technical risk, a legal risk, and because we're maybe talking about Asia, we may have regional risk as well that we may have to consider. For example, I would not want my citizen data, and I'm just a random country, or I could use the example of Australia. In Australia, if I am an Australian citizen, I would not want my Australian citizen data to leave Australia. And it may be the same case for Thailand, Vietnam, Japan, Korea. A lot of us would have requirements from our government to not send our data overseas to a third party. Now, it sounds like a reasonable expectation to have that, yes, we don't want our citizen data to leave our country. However, if there is no data center by the most popular cloud service provider, you may look at alternates to speed up the production of your product, maybe without using cloud service provider, because that could be a risk that you may not be comfortable in taking. You may say that as long as there is no data center in our country, in our home country, we would not be comfortable to take the risk of storing our personal identifiable information or citizen data or any other data, for example, even credit card information. We would not be comfortable in having that stored in a cloud service provider that doesn't have a data center in our country. Which again brings me to the shared responsibility. So as we go through the building blocks, you'll realize some of the terminology that I've called out earlier becomes quite relevant throughout all the building blocks that you, as you work through different stages of your cloud security roadmap. Now, from a risk perspective, you have to consider the shared responsibility. We spoke about data just now, but you may also look at things like infrastructure as well. Who would own the infrastructure? Do you want to own the infrastructure? Maybe you may be looking at something like infrastructure as a service. Or do you want to just manage the application? In that case, you could be looking at something like a platform as a service. Or the third option could be you don't want to do with anything to do with the application or anything to do with the infrastructure. You just want to run the application or sign up for a service and just start working on it, basically start using it. So depending on the choice you make, that would also define the kind of risk profile your organization may have gone through. In most scenarios, if an organization has gone through a digital transformation process, or they're going through a DevOps or an agile transformation, they usually have to come up with a decision. Someone at the leadership would make a decision to say, all right, moving forward, our thinking is that all new products would either be built using a SaaS service, which is software as a service, or would be built using platform as a service, or would be built using infrastructure as a service, or we would just decommission any of the old applications that we do not use anymore and are not worth moving onto the cloud. Those are some of the initial things you may consider as part of building your risk management profile for the entire cloud security roadmap, so that when you build a risk profile for what's the cost of moving onto a cloud provider, you are able to call that out to your leadership that, hey, we can't go for this particular cloud service provider because they don't have a data center in this country. So as an organization which has a lot of sensitive information, we cannot accept this risk. Or you could choose the path of, because the organization has said that the first priority should be to use a SaaS service or use the PaaS as a service and then use IaaS, then you, as an organization, you can say, yep, we are comfortable to move into cloud because we understand the data requirement. And we also understand that these are the risks we may have to share with the cloud service provider. Another risk that you will be sharing with your cloud service provider is of compliance. As I mentioned earlier, there would be some industry specific compliance requirements that your organization may have. It could be PCI, which is for your credit card. It could also be for your sensitive information that you may be sharing. There might be a legal as well as a privacy act that you may have to comply to around data privacy. Excuse me. And depending on the kind of service you may use, that posture may change as well. So if you are not aware already, not all services within all cloud service provider have the same level of compliance. As a cloud service provider, there would be some level of compliance that the cloud service provider may already have, but they may also choose to have only certain services within the cloud service provider have certain industry standard compliance assigned to it. For example, most of the services that are common, like your virtual machine, they tend to have most of the common certificates like your SOC 2, ISO 27001, PCI. They have a lot of those services already approved from a compliance perspective. So if you are thinking of holding a workload which requires, for example, PCI, for that to be moved onto the cloud, then you would have to consider the fact that, okay, I'm only going to use services that are going to be PCI compliant in that cloud service provider, because shared responsibility model, the services that I'm using on by my cloud service provider, the PCI requirement for that is being taken care of by them, and anything else is being taken care of by us. So we would maintain the PCI compliance for the application that we manage, and any infrastructure requirement which we are using a cloud service provider for, they need to have the compliance standard for that. Now, another risk you would consider across is supply chain risk. As an organization which may be working with other third parties or other SaaS services for maybe a plan that your leadership may have said, hey, we are using SaaS services only. We would not be using IaaS, PaaS. We're either decommissioning or we're using a SaaS. Now, that could also be a strategy that your organization may go down the path of. If you do go down that path, you would have to open up to the idea that your third-party risk which is already inclusive of your cloud service provider, because you still have to include them as having some SLA or a service level agreement for how much uptime would these cloud service providers have. And before anyone in the crowd says, hey, it's a very low probability that any of these cloud service providers go down. But I don't know how much of a surprise this would be for people who may have been keeping up with the news, but all three major service providers, all three of them had vulnerabilities announced, public vulnerabilities announced last year in 2021. At least two of them, I think Google and AWS had outages. I believe Microsoft had an outage as well. So it's not uncommon anymore to hear that cloud service providers also have outages. They also have probably vulnerabilities that are not being patched. In a lot of ways, they are very similar to the organization that you may be working in already. So you have to understand the third-party risks that you accept as part of working on the cloud service provider, which your leadership, as well as your business and the board, should be aware of as well. One more thing that you would come across is, as you kind of build the process of cloud security roadmap, you've thought about the risk from a third-party perspective. You've thought about risk from what you share with your third-party cloud service provider perspective. You thought about compliance risk as well. One more risk that you probably have is more from a data risk privacy. Now, this is, again, going back to the example where, based on the data that you have, you may have to consider that, are you comfortable to share the personal identifiable information that is accepted by your organization in something like a cloud service provider that you may not trust? Now, one of the companies that I've consulted for in the past, where we had this dilemma where we wanted to get PCI compliant, but we did not know if we could trust the services enough. This is obviously a few years ago when cloud was quite new. And I age myself as I say this, that I have been working in the cloud space for almost 8 years now. And the first couple of years when I would try and work in the space and I would talk to other CISOs, the conversation would rotate around, is cloud secure? Although that's not a question that's being asked anymore right now, because there's a lot more trust level. There's a lot more customers like Netflix. There's a lot of customers like I think for people who may be in the Asian space, Ola is one of the services that is also on cloud. I believe quite a few product companies are already using cloud across Asia. And a lot of websites are also using cloud in the background. So nowadays, it's quite common to hear a lot of people are moving onto the cloud because the trust level for cloud is a lot more higher, especially after all the third-party audits and I guess the resources that people like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have been building over the years to build that trust in their customers, both existing and new. But coming back to your personal identifiable information, you may choose the path of thinking that because that company wanted to do PCI compliance, they decided to not use the cloud for PCI. They decided we would put everything else in the cloud except for the pieces that require PCI compliance. Now, there are other ways to deal with this as well. You could have segregation of environments within your cloud provider. For example, if the initiative from the organization is that everything on premise, which is the data center that you may be working on, everything needs to go to the cloud or be replaced by a SaaS service. In that scenario, you can have segregation in your cloud provider to have separate compliance environments as well. So there are ways around this. So you may have to consider that as part of your data and privacy risk. You can also choose that, hey, there is no data center in my country, so I'm not comfortable by moving into this cloud service provider. Totally fine to do that as well. That answer to that would depend on the kind of company that you work in, and which also brings me to stakeholder management. Every time anyone's moving to the cloud, there's usually a couple of motivation drivers that you can look out for. The driver could be things like maybe the data center is coming to expiry soon, and you're looking for a more effective as well as possibly a cheaper option that you could be looking at. You could also look at things like there are new projects coming in. For example, you may have a big data project where you have a lot of data, you're trying to do data analysis. What would that look like for you? And you may come up with the conclusion that actually I have to use a cloud service provider, otherwise I can't deliver this project. So there could be things like that you might have to find out and identify, because one part of being a security person in an organization is collaborating with others so that you can create great you can create good guardrails from the beginning, so you don't have to come back and try and fix it. So a good way to do this is identify the stakeholders for doing the cloud migration. Try and see how you can work with them on collaborating and adding roles that are probably more, how do I put this? It's beneficial for both. It gives the organization a good security posture, but at the same time, it allows for the organization to move fast as well. So the key word being remain secure, but still go fast. Having that is obviously a great thing. What you find as you talk to stakeholders, a lot of them would have gone through the part of evaluating what kind of applications that they should be looking at as part of moving into cloud, or just the migration, or just the transformation. Now, as part of doing that, they would have looked at, okay, these applications are quite easy to migrate, so we're going to put them in one bucket. And then there is these applications which probably are not going to make it in cloud, so we may decommission these. And there could be a third bucket, a fourth bucket, a fifth bucket. There could be multiple buckets that they could be looking at for the kind of migration or the kind of transformation they could be doing for applications in cloud. Having an understanding of that would mean you're also able to help them plan for what makes sense in a cloud first world for security to be integrated into the space. So integration of security is a key over here. Let's talk about the actual roadmap. We spoke about the business side so far. As someone who's building the roadmap as well, you probably should have some understanding of what are some of the building blocks for each, I guess, environment that you're building for cloud in any cloud provider. This is applicable for all cloud service providers, whether it's public or private, or even hybrid for that matter. You should be able to use this to help build that effective roadmap that you can plan towards. So first one being identity and access management. Identity is the new parameter for security in the cloud space. Most of the attack vectors or most of the threats you hear about on the cloud for things like, oh, you left your access key for your AWS on GitHub, which is a popular source code repository, or someone found the username password for someone's AWS or GCP account in, say, stackoverflow.com. One of the examples also came out from Google was they had given a lot more permission than they should have to certain roles within the GCP environment. So there could be multiple examples of how identity has been misused as a way to, I guess, have a public vulnerability, publicly disposed vulnerability, to highlight the importance of identity. Or if you have access to someone's identity in a cloud service provider, that basically gives you access to everything that they're doing. You don't necessarily need a work laptop, for example, that you may think, oh, in my office is protected, because in my office, I come in and because it's a physical machine, or I have a LAN cable, I have to plug into a cable, or if I have to connect to the Wi-Fi before I can even access my company resources. Cloud doesn't work like that. In a cloud context, I could be on my home laptop, personal laptop, in my house, or maybe even in, I don't know, middle of Maldives, having a great time enjoying my vacation, and I decided to check on my cloud environment. I just need a laptop. I go onto the URL for my favorite cloud provider, and I just log in. Like, there is no restriction. And as I said, because it's a shared responsibility and it's a service available on the internet, anyone, anywhere in the world can access it, unless you put some guardrails around who can access the service directly or who can make what changes within the cloud service provider. That's where identity is quite key. There are a few questions you would ask yourself as you go through this, because there are multiple kinds of identities you may be dealing with in cloud. Now, as a general rule, everyone would be aware that all of us get regular access to our identity. We would also be aware that we get access to identity in terms of how do I put this? You get access to admin using a separate credential. You get specific username password for specific applications in your organization. In a cloud space, there's a lot more layers. By that, what I mean is you obviously have an identity that gives you access to the cloud, but depending on which cloud service provider you may be working with, you could have identities that only exist in that cloud service provider as also being available that your staff can create. So having a good understanding of that based on the cloud service provider you're using is quite crucial. Another one is the API. If you are someone who's in an organization that is going through a DevOps transformation, where maybe you have a really old application that's been digitally transformed and being made into microservices, it has an API, and that's being available on the internet, what you might find is there are identities over there as well. It could be an identity of your customer. It could be an identity of your staff. It could also be an identity of a third party that you work with or quote unquote partner with. You give them credentials so that they can access your API and use that as a way to, I guess, give out services. But the bottom line here is, as you kind of go through the identity access management, after doing identity access management for 3 years of my life, there was one thing that I was told always: no matter how big the organization or how small the organization, if you stick with one source of truth for identity, you're in good hands. By that, what I mean is decide what would be the true source of identity for employee example, Ashish. I may be working on this super amazing podcast called Cloud Security Podcast, which has hundreds of staff members. And we may be using all three cloud service providers: Amazon, Microsoft, Google. We may choose to go, that's all good, but we would only use our Active Directory as our source of truth for who is Ashish, what kind of rights he has access to, and what cloud service providers can he access. So that becomes our, I guess, the single source of truth that we stick with. So I would encourage you and recommend you to find the same in your organization. The next thing we talk about is infrastructure and configuration management in the building block. You have a great application that you decided, okay, this is a perfect application and it's in the right bucket that I've spoken to my stakeholders. How do I start building towards it? Now, there are quite a few moving parts for DevOps, I guess, practice. And I don't want to go through all the quote unquote ceremonies that they have in this talk, because we'll take the whole day for this. But one thing to understand, some of those terminologies on the screen right now, they are always good to at least have an understanding of, and probably definitely encourage you to look up DevOps and what are some of the components of DevOps. CI/CD pipeline is what helps you deploy applications as, I guess, in a way that you are able to release new softwares, new features multiple times a day or multiple times a week. Network as a code, your entire cloud environment can be written as a code, which is why developers can easily start developing applications on cloud without the need to worry about infrastructure. Sometimes the cloud may use its own resources to build a network for you automatically, or your security team can decide what would the network look like for the entire organization when they're using a cloud service provider. Another one, I guess the very bottom of it, is you can use something called infrastructure as code. You can basically write the entire thing, which is, when I say entire thing, what I mean is, imagine you're trying to build, I don't know, cloudsecuritypodcast.tv, which is our website. You use that as an example. That has an S3 bucket from Amazon in the back, which is hosting the website. Now, I would have written the entire thing as code. By that, what I mean is I'm using a standard template language from my cloud service provider to build an infrastructure in cloud, with automation, yes, you can automate security. So I don't have to log in as it used to be the case where people who may be from a sysadmin background, or you may have friends who are sysadmin, you can ask them. System administrators, they used to have to log in into a box, install the operating system, identify what softwares you need, and go through the entire process for weeks before you can even get to the point of, oh, now it's ready for me to start developing my application. So all that can be codified in a cloud world, and that is amazing. So definitely one of the great building block. Now, as we have kind of started developing a lot more applications in cloud, there's a lot of problem areas or gaps, for lack of a better word, that have been identified. Now, I want to thank Gartner for the list of abbreviations I have on the screen. These 4-letter words, you can start from the top: CASB, CWPP, CSPM, CNAP, CIEM, SSPM. These are some of the terminologies of products that you might have to look for based on the kind of roadmap that you're building and based on the problems that you're trying to solve by migrating into a cloud. Talking about each one of these probably would take me a long time, but it definitely is something that I would encourage you to check out. Each one of these is, I guess, filled with products that can help you. But I would also call out, you don't need these products on the day one. These are, by the way, these are not product names. These are product categories that have been defined by Gartner as things people should be looking out for when they are building applications in cloud. Couple of examples for this could be CSPM, where you could talk about the entire posture of your cloud environment. You could look at workload protection, which is basically the application is called workload. How do you protect your application? What are some of the malware protection, that kind of a thing as well. So something I'll definitely encourage, but probably would take me the entire rest of the talk for just going through each one of these. So I would recommend you definitely check those abbreviations out and see which ones may be applicable for the scale you are at. If you're starting today, you don't need to think about this services, but having an understanding of this means that when you reach a certain scale, you would be able to at least know what applications or what kind of application you should look at. Which also brings me to multi-cloud. If you would have spoken to me, like I started working in the cloud space 7-8 years ago. If you would have spoken to me 7-8 years ago about multi-cloud, I would have said that is not a thing that's going to happen. But as time has passed on, a lot of people, let's just say, have figured out ways where they definitely need another cloud service provider in their organization. Now, this sometimes is not by choice. Your current company may choose to buy another company that may be using a completely different cloud service provider to what your current company has. So there might be a few decisions that you would have to make. There is, and I mentioned earlier about the cloud adoption framework and how each one of the cloud service providers have a adoption framework. They also have something called a well-architected framework. What that is basically a well-architected framework from Amazon, Google Cloud, or Azure. It talks about how do you define a well-architected solution in their product. But what they don't do a great job of is they don't tell you how to do all of them together, which is kind of what the multi-cloud problem is. As security people, for me as a role of a security leader in my organization, I sometimes have to juggle with the fact that there might be certain products that would only work in a particular cloud service provider and really great, but do not do the same job at somewhere else. Similarly, there might be solutions that you may have at the moment which do not do a great job of, I guess, running an effective product. So you may have to shift gears to another product. I'm using Oracle Cloud as an example, where a lot of people have started using Oracle Cloud. Some have found real good success with it. Some have found that to be not as mature. Not that I'm saying it's not mature, I'm sure it is. I personally haven't used it, but it's things like that that you would get introduced to as you kind of go through that process. So one thing that would save you when you have to deal with multi-cloud is having a centralized baseline for this template. And apologies if you can hear my dog in the background, the thing from working from home. The compliance-driven control is something that I would definitely encourage you to have. The idea being the fact that if you set a baseline template for your cloud, you are able to have at least an understanding for, oh, I want encryption to be everywhere. I might encryption at rest, encryption in transit, irrespective of which cloud it is. That could be part of a baseline template. Another thing that could be part of a baseline template would be the fact that you only want to operate in the region that you currently reside. You may say, I only want my data to be only in Japan, or only in Korea, or only in Vietnam, Thailand. Depending on what you decide, you can drive the baseline template to go in that direction, which means when you're building your roadmap, think about from a across the, I guess, multi-clouds of the world perspective. I would not drive control policies based on the cloud service provider you work with. That's the bigger takeaway over here. You want to rely more on the security fundamentals, things like I want encryption everywhere. I want to make sure there are different defensive layers before people can do anything. I want to make sure my identity is one source of truth. Like the basic hygiene things you would look at from an, I guess, a good cloud security posture perspective, you would want to consider all of those as your baseline and not rely on individual features or services from your cloud service provider. Many things to consider here. You could consider your data requirement, as we have been talking about earlier. You could consider your organization's preference, whether they want to go SaaS first, IaaS first, PaaS first. You could look at your industry specific requirement as well. If there are certain requirements that you need to abide by as part of being from a certain industry, having an understanding of what kind of data are you comfortable with moving into cloud as well. It's quite crucial when you're building your cloud security roadmap. Now, as part of building application, it's worthwhile calling out, just because you have a vulnerable application on your on-premise or your data center, moving that to cloud would not make it secure. So you would still have to do threat modeling and understand what are some of the, I guess, application threats you should be looking at. Even if for people who may be aware of Owasp, which is the Open Web Application Project, so those folks, it's a free community, anyone can be part of it. Each year, well, at least not each year, every year or so, they bring in the top 10 security vulnerabilities that they find in most applications across the world. They did an update in 2021. And if you look at the screenshot on the slide, quite a few of them, in fact, the very first one, which is broken access control, the fifth one, which is security misconfiguration, even the fourth one, insecure design. Then there is the seventh one, sixth one, as well as the 10th one. So at least 5 out of the 10 are all cloud related. We have been talking about the threat just before, but you can already see that the adoption of cloud has increased quite a bit. And a lot of the vulnerabilities are going towards the, let's just say, more cloud focused ones. So it's also important to understand the threat from that perspective. So you can look at the Owasp Top 10 2021, as we have pointed out already, or you can also look at the MITRE Cloud Matrix framework. The MITRE attack framework, for people who may not be aware, they talk about something called a kill chain. The kill chain is, how do hackers got access to, what's an example that I can use? Capital One probably was the most recent cloud hack that you can think of. Now, if you have gone through the court case documentation for the ex-Amazon employee that was sued, you can have an understanding for how she was able to get access to Capital One data based on the understanding of the environment she had. Now, that process of where she would have started to how she landed on the S3 bucket, which had all the credit card information. I believe it was the credit card information, but anyone on the chat can confirm I'm right or wrong. And they were able to call out the fact that oh, that's the kill chain that we should be going for. As you've gone through that process, understanding that kill chain is quite important for you to think about. These are the threats that I'm worried about. For going back to the first principle thinking, these are some of the things that I'm worried about from a threat to my cloud resource perspective. You can obviously detect some of these threats and respond appropriately as well. And as part of this, you can build some logging, monitoring practices. It's worthwhile calling out, your existing product may also not withstand the time of being in a cloud or being translating into a cloud. Now, the simple answer to this could be, you could find software that are meant for cloud. They call themselves cloud first, which means they might have capabilities like they may not require an agent to work in your cloud account. And for people who may have worked on who may have worked on data center security products, you would have heard the word agent before, and how like a lot of us may have laptops from our workplace which has agents to protect a laptop from viruses and other things. So if you are looking for a solution for cloud from a threat detection response perspective, my usual recommendation is to look for solutions that are more cloud first, that they understand the context of cloud. You don't have to do a lot of customization to start using them in your cloud. And it's also not a band-aid fix for what should have been in the cloud. Supply chain is also fascinating because as you're moving your application, traditionally your application would have been working with a lot of third party already. It would have been working with things like your partners who may be services that you may be using are provided by a third-party partner, and you didn't want to build it, so you signed an agreement with a third party and started using that there. You could also have to think about from a data perspective, like a lot of organizations would have data that is being captured by them is being used for research purposes by other companies. And there might be some sort of exchange going on for, hey, we are trying to build a effective traffic analyzing software. I'm making up an example here, but to do that, you need access to a lot of data, and maybe you require help of a third-party partner to work on how do I analyze all this traffic data that I'm collecting either on my website or on the general roads. So that is also becoming a consideration you would have to have for third-party supply chain. If you are looking for an example for how supply chain can go bad, you don't have to go too far. There is an example from a company called Cambridge Analytica that was a supply chain for Facebook. And because Cambridge Analytica was selling the data and misusing the data to affect the election results and a lot more political things, they obviously got highlighted and Facebook got into hot water because of it. But hopefully this is a reminder to have some kind of compliance and security requirement from your supply chain. And as part of the migration, this could be a way to start those conversations. If you haven't had those conversations yet, this could be a great way to start having those conversations about what do you do for security? What do you do for compliance? And for people who may have heard about Log4j, that happened in December, just a few months ago, a lot of people who may have felt that they were not affected by Log4j later on found that most of the libraries they may have consumed, they may or may not have had an exposure to Log4j. So there were a lot of people trying to reach out to their supply chain. Sometimes they did not have a contact for who the supply chain owner is, who should they talk to for security breaches like the Log4j, where someone can potentially take over their application. Like things like that become quite crucial. And having a cloud migration project or a cloud security roadmap building process could be a great way to start that conversation, at least having some kind of a knowledge about what you need to do. As you kind of go through that process, Another thing you might have to consider is whether it's multi-cloud or not multi-cloud, your team may require training for what they need to do in cloud. You may have people in your team that may have been doing IT for a long time, or maybe for a very short time. Everyone would require some perspective for how do I start protecting cloud? What kind of services for security exist in cloud? Basically, at that point, you may also have to consider, should I use the services that are provided by a cloud service provider, or should I just use my existing service in the cloud? And I'm comfortable with it. I don't want to change the security product that I use. One consideration could be to have a lot of cross-functional team. By this example, what I mean is a lot of organizations would have security people be part of the cloud migration project teams and use that as a way to have your organization cross-pollinate the information of how to learn about security. And that's how you can train them as well for a lot more projects that might come their way. Now, these are some of the resources that I have, I guess, reference to for people if they want to do more research, want to find out more. You can obviously check out the Forward CloudSec is a great conference. It's coming up in June 2020. They made the announcement, I think last week or maybe a couple of days ago. They're happening in June. There are conferences from each of your cloud service provider. Amazon has one in December called AWS reInvent. Microsoft has something called Microsoft Ignite. Google has something called Google Next. SANS obviously has webinars like these and summits that you can attend to upskill yourself on the roadmap. We, of course, have the MGT 520, which is a course that I co-teach with Jason Lamb. You can also refer to the podcast as well. We have affiliations with Cloud Security Podcast and Cloud Security News. The Cloud Security Podcast interviews people from Netflix, Capital One, LinkedIn, to name a few examples of the kind of companies that have been represented on the podcast, where industry experts come and talk about how do they do cloud security. And Cloud Security News is a weekly news podcast around what are some of the news that you should know of in a cloud security space. I would also recommend checking out the cloud adoption framework by each of the cloud service provider, as well as the well-architected framework, which is provided by all three of the AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. I believe Alibaba has one as well. I think they have a cloud adoption framework as well, but I would let you correct me. But those are some of the resources that you can definitely use. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Hopefully everyone had, I guess, informative session. And I would love to answer any questions if there are any questions. I believe there's a question that came in. I'm happy to answer that here. Should be okay. So there's a question from Melvin Chi. Any suggestions on how to protect my data if I were to migrate from on-premise to SaaS? Would a CASB be able to protect against data leakage due to misconfiguration of SaaS? That is a good question. The short answer is, the way I would see CASB is, a CASB is it's a glorified proxy. It's a good way to see what resources are being accessed by your organization. People normally use this when they're trying to find out shadow IT. And you can also use this to identify if there are cloud service providers being used. In terms of preventing data leakage, I haven't seen an example. So what people end up doing normally is they would use an encryption gateway for something like this. They would normally go down the path of saying, hey, I'm going to encrypt my data before I leave the premise of the organization. That's what you can do with the CASB, but that also expects the fact that you would have I guess you would already have a solution for it, which is outside the CASB. In terms of specifically data leakage, that problem has not entirely been solved by cloud in general. Like AWS has something called AWS Macy, which is a service that helps you detect sensitive software, or sorry, sensitive text in your S3 bucket, but it doesn't really translate well to language. I think I have kind of recollection of a incident that we had where I believe we had some text written in Chinese, and Macy could not understand that it was sensitive information written in Chinese. So I think if it's in English, the personal identifiable information, it usually works well. So that's probably an example of a data leakage. And it also is an example of a fact that you're able to, your best bet is to have some data classification beforehand. If you have some data classification done beforehand for what kind of data that you're comfortable with to send across in your cloud service provider, that's the best way to have at least an understanding of it. But as it stands, the DLP solution that I can think of from Microsoft is probably another one, but they usually limit themselves to other services. They don't look inside your cloud service provider. So there is definitely a gap. So hopefully that answers your question. I've got a question again from Nguyen Yu. Is there a template checklist to assess cybersecurity of a CSP before you migrate data to cloud? That's a good question as well. So a lot of cloud service providers would normally tell you, hey, use our compliance standards as a way to test our security. You can request them for a pen test report. Usually when you're assessing any third party, you can ask them for compliance certificates. You can ask them for pen test reports. It got so popular that a lot of cloud service providers have started giving most of the, they started giving most of their compliance certificates straight from the software itself. So that could be one way, but I would normally use other customers or maybe other people in your industry as an example for are they comfortable to use it. I would probably say to a large extent, the cloud service provider themselves may be, I guess, decent in security, but based on how you configure the application that you're putting into the cloud, that responsibility, I'm going to use the example of shared responsibility, that would depend on you as someone who's putting the application there. You will be responsible for that security because you sign a contract with, say, Amazon, Google, or Microsoft. If they had a breach at their end, you can get some kind of compensation for it, and they could be, I'm sure you can get compensation for it. That's my assumption. But there hasn't been a case yet where the cloud service provider directly, I guess, misused their service. There have been people who have been ex-employees of the cloud service provider, which was a Capital One example. So hopefully that helps you get your answer. Question from Vinay. I'm an Indian here. I'd like to know if there are any internship opportunities for students like me, especially in cloud and cybersecurity. If yes, you can mention a few. There's definitely quite a few. I would encourage checking out LinkedIn and probably your local, I guess, job search site. There's definitely quite a few, but feel free to reach out on Cloud Security Podcast, man. Bobby Lim, great material. Thank you. Earlier, you mentioned on single source of truth to manage identities. How does this work well with privileged IDs the organizations use for the longest time? Do you mean some form of orchestration is required? Good question. So depending on how your organization deals with privileged ID, in a cloud context, you can choose to use what we do with traditional environments where there's an Ashish, which is a normal user, and then there is an Ashish, which is an admin user, where you split the usage. You can also go down the path of having a trust level being built. Now, I don't want to use the word zero trust, but I'm sure people have heard it. The idea behind this is it's not the orchestration piece, it's the fact that your single source of identity. So if you're saying Ashish, the normal user, can have access to AWS, Google, Azure, you are giving them a single sign-on or some kind of a industry standard is being used to translate my source of truth, which is my which is my Active Directory credential. You're using that as a way, as my single source of truth to authenticate me to any of the cloud service provider. Instead of creating an identity for me in each one of the cloud service provider, you're using the industry standard like SAML, SAML, or SSO as ways to, I guess, extend the single source of truth to different cloud service provider. Quite a few questions here. Two more to go. Prapanch, what are your recommendations for transitioning to Ascor strategy from traditional mode of managing infrastructure policy? Looking at this, especially from a multi-cloud and a hybrid standpoint, where multiple as code option exist and decision-making is challenging for practitioners. That is another great question. It is a known problem where it's a choice of the developer to pick the language they prefer using. And I don't think there has been a one solution that fits all. However, what we definitely find is if you have a standard policy for security, as a code becomes a lot more that. So in some of the organizations that I have worked for, where the only way we could scale security was by defining a baseline template. As I was saying earlier, you can define a template for this is what encryption should look like. Doesn't matter what the cloud service provider is. And if there's a capability to make it as a code, A, you should have the right skill set in your team to achieve that. And B, you should also have the right kind of environment to facilitate this as well. By that, what I mean is, say, for example, if you have a skilled team member, but they don't have an opportunity to work on something which is automate something into a code, that definitely would be a challenge. But from a governance perspective, I normally found that having a template is the best way to go down that path. Cool. A few more questions. What's your view on the importance of MFA for cloud security, particularly using FIDO as the underlying authentication protocol? 100%. MFA is definitely great. Do MFA, especially because identity is a new thing. So you should definitely do that. I was an anonymous attendee. How would you approach data classification in cloud? To what degree of detail would you approach data classification? I normally keep it quite simple. One is secret, confidential, public. You can just start with those three. Secret being something that is so super secret for your organization that it should not leave beyond, say, I don't know, a small set of people. Could be 5, could be 10, that small set of people. The best example for this is think about from this way. If it's a salary, for example, which may be sensitive to share in a lot of different organizations across different countries, you could say that, oh, only the manager and the manager's manager should have access to that. So that's a secret information and HR should know of it. And so it could also be things like your organization is talking about buying another company. Now that is something which is confidential. Like you can tell the entire company about it, but that information should remain within the organization. It should not be, say, press should not be spoken about it. So that's an example of confidential. Example of public is if you have a public website, anything that you have there is technically public. So I normally use that as a gauge for having basically 3 simple ways to identify the different data classification you can have. Right. Question, so this is a question from Etuluva. Would you suggest using a third-party platform to manage a hybrid cloud? Something that abstracts the underlying layer? I would say you don't have to start with this. Once you have, there are examples from all cloud providers. There is CIS benchmark, Center of Internet Security. There are benchmarks like that you can use as a baseline, because before you, there are a couple of ways to look at this. If you have the right skill set, then yeah, go for it. Go for a tool that helps you solve the problem, because the scale of the problem could be really large. But if you have a small cloud environment, maybe you don't need the third-party tool in the beginning. You just need the right skill set in your team to understand what is required to protect that. So that's what my suggestion, but anything more probably requires a lot more conversation and understanding. Any cloud standards recommended? That is by Dakshina Murthy. So yes, there are CIS benchmark. All CIS benchmark does exist for all cloud service providers. There is also something from Cloud Security Alliance, which is a independent body that is producing security reports every year. And they're also releasing an assessment standard. I think they call it STAR, STAR, which is cloud agnostic. So you should be able to use that as a standard as well. However, if you are thinking of a one particular cloud, looking at their cloud adoption framework or their well-architected framework is also good. Reviewing some of their online, like all of them have YouTube channels and they all share customer examples over there. So that could be another way to see what you could use. Anil Lode, your question is, for DevSecOps and privacy by design, what are components to be considered from an application lifecycle perspective? From a DevSecOps and application lifestyle, you can look at culture, but if your question is specifically around tooling, you could look at things like what can you do for static code analysis, software composition analysis, secret scanning. I normally recommend if you have not done any DevSecOps, start with secret scanning, then graduate onto software composition analysis, which is basically looking at any third-party libraries that you could be looking at, which could be vulnerable. So start there, and then third one being software composition analysis. Obviously, continue doing your annual pen test or quarterly pen test, and whatever pen test regime that you have. That should be a good enough start for, I mean, those are some of the moving components of DevSecOps from a technical perspective, but then there is a whole culture piece. How do you work with developers? How do you build a security champions program that can basically help you work effectively with the cloud service not cloud service provider, effectively work with the developers. Cool. I think that's all the questions that came through. I hope everyone got value out of this webinar. I look forward to work. Oh, I think I've got another slide. There you go. That's what's. Please answer the short survey after this, but I look forward to hearing from all of you somewhere in the internet. But hopefully you got some valuable out of it, and looking forward to working with you or listening to your webinar again.